Let's talk about what many Careblazers wish they knew sooner about the diagnosis process. So, a lot of people assume that getting a diagnosis of some type of dementia should be a pretty straightforward process. You go to the doctor, maybe they do a test, you get a clear answer. But nothing can be further from the truth. So, this month we're doing a series called What I Wish I Knew Sooner, and we're choosing different areas about dementia care and dementia in general. And this one's about the diagnosis process. So during my time of working with Careblazers over the years, I've heard a lot of repeat things, and I want to share them with you so that if you're struggling or frustrated or overwhelmed or confused about why getting a dementia diagnosis seems so hard or drawn out or long, this video is for you. And in case you haven't met me before, I'm Dr. Natali Edmonds, a board certified geropsychologist and the founder of Dementia Careblazers. We post free videos here every single week. Let's start with the reality of how a dementia diagnosis process starts. So, in my years starting out, I worked in a geriatric assessment center, which basically means I worked in a center with other geriatric experts, and our whole goal was to figure out, is the person who's coming to see us, do they have some type of dementia? Or is it something else? Maybe they have nothing wrong with them, or maybe it's like normal aging things, right? And so the majority of the people who came to us for an assessment, they were referred by their primary care providers or neurologists, either because that doctor noticed something was off or because the family member was reporting concerns. Now, a lot of times when the family members would come to me and I would do an interview and figure out, like, what are you noticing? What, are you concerned about? They would often say, I didn't really notice anything was really so off until maybe like an adult child or somebody who didn't come around a lot came in for a visit and they noticed a big shift and they brought up that big obvious change to the primary caregiver. And then that's when the primary caregiver started thinking, oh my, like maybe something is going on. So the majority of people actually, when they came to get official testing, and we came to the point of we're going to give you an official diagnosis of some type, a lot of them were already in the middle stages of the disease, what we would consider the moderate stage, because it's so easy to miss the subtle signs in the beginning. It's not always obvious memory loss in the beginning. So it's easy for family members to miss, but also it's easy for healthcare providers to miss, like primary care providers, neurologists, and especially if they're not trained in dementia in particular, they think the person's supposed to have obvious memory problems in the beginning, and that's not the case. We don't need memory problems at all to have dementia. So not only are the changes subtle, but not everybody has the training to pick up on those subtle cues. So even healthcare providers miss it. One of the reasons why it can be really hard to pin down an official diagnosis is that there's no single test that tells you whether or not somebody has dementia. It's not like people take a blood test for cholesterol or they take an x-ray to see if there's a broken bone. It's not that simple. And technically, dementia isn't even a diagnosis. It's an umbrella term, it's a category, it's used to describe a set of symptoms such as thinking problems and physical problems that together amount to a sort of dementia. There are different types of dementia, and the type is actually what is the diagnosis. So what we're actually trying to diagnose are what's behind the symptoms, what's causing the memory loss, what's causing the confusion, what's causing the problems with driving and managing medications and finances. So sometimes that cause is literally Alzheimer's disease. Sometimes it's Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, vascular changes. That would be a vascular dementia. Maybe it's something else. Sometimes we don't actually know. The healthcare provider will do all these testings. Our team would do all these tests, and we're like, definitely this looks like a dementia, but we don't know what's causing it. And in those cases, we just say, we think you have some type of dementia, even though technically dementia isn't a specific diagnosis. Is it confusing yet? I told you, it's not so straightforward, right? Another thing many people aren't told is that the actual diagnosis can change over time. So what starts out as maybe this is Alzheimer's might later turn into, actually, this looks more like vascular dementia. As the disease progresses and we get more symptoms and we get more information, we have more time to figure out what's going on. as the time and the dementia progresses and the symptoms evolve, so does the clinical picture. And sometimes that clinical picture becomes more clear, so the actual diagnosis changes. Also, it's entirely possible that somebody gets a first diagnosis, let's say Alzheimer's disease, since that's the most common, and in time they develop another type on top of that. Most commonly, vascular dementia. Maybe they have a stroke. And so now we have somebody who has Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, two different types of dementia at the same time. That's entirely possible too. Now, what really great clinicians do before any sort of dementia diagnosis is even considered is they start with a very good diagnostic workup, always ruling out what could be contributing to these symptoms. So there are many different health conditions that look like dementia that if we treat them, the problems start to go away and get better because it's not dementia. But if we don't rule them out, the person might accidentally get a diagnosis of dementia when they don't actually have it. So initially, for a good diagnostic workup, the healthcare provider is going to do tests for the thyroid because low thyroid can look like dementia. They're going to do tests for vitamin deficiencies because certain vitamin deficiencies can look like dementia, like low vitamin B12. They're going to rule out the chance that there's any sort of infection happening. Like if you've ever seen somebody who maybe has a urinary tract infection and they're older, they might look really confused. Or they're going to rule out medication side effects because certain medication side effects can cause confusion. So in the beginning, they're going to just rule out anything it could possibly be. And then they're going to get referred to a specialist, usually a neurologist and or a neuropsychologist. Those two are kind of like the power duo in figuring out, does this person actually have a dementia process going on? Neuropsychological testing, which is what the neuropsychologist will do or the geropsychologist would do, that's going to take several hours usually. And it's often maybe broken up into chunks where the first hour is going to be a clinical interview. And that's where you, the Careblazer, will play a very important piece. That clinician, the neuropsychologist, should be asking you some questions about what you're noticing in your loved one, what kinds of changes you noticed, things like that. They're also going to ask your loved one, the person with possible dementia, they're going to ask them some questions just to see what their answers are. Then, after that, they're going to get a series of cognitive tests. And for these tests, family members are usually not allowed in the room. That's to make sure that their answers are that person's answers. They function independently. There's been studies that show when a family member's in the room or an observer's in the room, it can impact test results. Plus, it's for test security. We have to secure the questions and tasks we're doing. So often family members are not involved. And that testing takes hours. And a lot of times people will say, oh no, I was allowed to be there with my loved one when they got testing. And they're referring to that 30 question test that maybe the PCP or the neurologist does. That's called a mental status examination. That's just a temperature check. That's just let's just kind of dip our toe in and see if we think something weird is happening here or something's going on. That is not neuropsychological testing. Neuropsychological testing is going to be hours long. So there's a little bit, again, another reason why it's so confusing when it comes to getting a dementia diagnosis. Once that neuropsychologist does their testing, then it's not like the person gets the results then and there. That neuropsychologist is going to take the results, look at how that person did, compare how that person did to other people that same age, same education. If we have the available data, we'll compare them to their same race and we'll see, hey, did they perform like people who are similar to them? And if so, they're probably thinking just fine. But if there's anything that's significantly below that, then it starts to raise flags like we think something's going on. So the neuropsychologist is going to come up with their assessment basically of I think this is a dementia process based on this pattern of testing. We think it's this kind of dementia. So different types of dementia perform in different ways. We would expect a lot more memory problems in Alzheimer's disease than maybe somebody with Lewy body dementia, for example. And so they're putting those pieces together. And then that typically goes back to the neurologist. And then, they're coming up together with what they think is happening. It's literally putting puzzle pieces together. It's not so cut and dry. For the most part, a really great dementia diagnosis process is going to involve multiple specialists. One exception being if the person is already in the pretty advanced stages of dementia and it's really clear what's going on, then usually a primary care provider will just say, yeah, we think this is what's going on. The primary care provider rules out all the other possibilities and they're like, yeah, this person is so impaired, they're not even going to be able to sit through the testing. It's not even worthwhile. So in those cases, testing usually isn't recommended. Okay, now let's talk about neuroimaging and blood tests. So sometimes the neurologist or PCP might order brain scans to look for signs of maybe a stroke, vascular disease, brain shrinkage, anything that could add to complete the puzzle to figure out what we think this is going on. And that's a good thing. It's just more information, but it's not always going to happen. It really just depends on how the other puzzle pieces are looking and whether we think sometimes that the brain imaging is going to add anything of value. I remember when I was working in the clinic and we would do some testing and it was very clear this person had some sort of dementia diagnosis. They were well into the moderate stages, maybe bordering on the severe stages of dementia. Very clear based on history and other lab results. We think that it's Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. There was really no use. There was no point of putting somebody through the brain scans. So we sometimes would not offer it. It wasn't going to change our recommendation, if that makes sense. Now, more recently, you may have heard on the news, there are blood tests that have been developed to look for things like amyloid and tau proteins, which are hallmarks for Alzheimer's disease. Now, those are very promising. They are definitely, being researched, but they're not widely used clinically right now, and it's not fully definitive. This is something on the very near horizon that is happening. It's happening in studies, but it's not yet widely adapted clinically. And when it is, it will give us even more like a better puzzle piece. But again, it's just going to be that piece of the puzzle. Now, if you're listening to this, you probably have a question. Many people do, and that is why even bother with a diagnosis? We don't have any cure. Why do we have to go through all this? That's a fair question. My best response to that is that sometimes, a lot of times, having a diagnosis of some sort of dementia, if the person has dementia, it opens the doors to the right services, right medications, support groups, and things like that. It also matters for practical reasons, like sometimes there are certain adult day programs or in-home supports or respite services or even a memory care facility that will require documentation of some sort of cognitive disorder. And so by having that, they might be able to qualify for those things. Now, something to consider that's not often talked about is if you are suspecting your loved one might actually have a dementia diagnosis and you're about to embark on the complicated process of getting a diagnosis, you might want to consider consulting with an elder law attorney and doing legal paperwork and maybe long-term care insurance applications prior. Because once the diagnosis of dementia, whatever type it is, gets on the record, it might make it more difficult for things like doing certain legal paperwork, trusts, wills, healthcare power of attorneys, financial power of attorneys, even being considered to get long-term care insurance. All those things become a little bit more complicated if there's a diagnosis of some type of dementia on the record. So this is a very long, kind of complicated video to describe what is a very long, complicated process most of the time. So here's to finalize what many Careblazers I talked to wish they knew earlier. One, a diagnosis is a process. It's not a moment. It's not a one-time thing. It's usually a multiple-time thing across multiple different providers. You may need to ask more than once because if you are catching subtle changes early on, you might be facing a healthcare provider that doesn't really see the value in testing or doesn't really think anything's going on because they are not dementia experts and think that unless somebody looks totally confused and has a lot of memory loss, they're fine. That's not necessarily the case. So sometimes the family member does have to be the advocate. It's okay to keep pushing for clarity, even if it's uncomfortable. And also, even though an official diagnosis can be scary, and even though there is not yet a cure, it can also be empowering because it helps prepare you for what's next. It can also open the doors for certain treatments and medications that maybe otherwise would not have been available. If this video helped you understand even a little bit more the process of diagnosis, then consider subscribing. You can click the red subscribe button on your screen. It makes it easier for you to know when another video is released, which is every single week. Also, it communicates to YouTube that this video was helpful to somebody like you. And so the chances are YouTube will put this video in front of another dementia care blazer out there in the world who is looking for answers and looking for information and has no idea that this channel exists. I really appreciate it. Also, if you are not yet subscribed to our free weekly newsletter, it's called the Dementia Dose. It's something you might be interested in. Every week, I send out an email with my top resources, tips. I usually include a free downloadable resource, products that are helpful to the care blazers I work with. If that's something you're interested in, just go to our website, careblazers.com or careblazers.com/dementia dose. Anything you would add if you've been through this complicated maze of the dementia diagnosis process, anything you would add that you think other care blazers should know about? You can leave that in a comment below. You never know who that could help. I'll be back next week with another video on something many care blazers wish they would have known sooner. We'll stick with that for the series. I'm sending you so much love. Bye. Also, Nico gets a belly rub for every person who subscribes from this video. So if you haven't already, click the red subscribe button. It's totally free, and Nico says thank you very much.